speaker, in January 2023, Chelsea signed Mudryk, who sucked, and he played like a 70k player, which was very convenient because he got paid 70k a week. If he ended up realising his potential and plays like a 300k player, that would be fine because he has incentive bonuses to join. And also, this is like much more likely to happen because he has the incentive bonus to play better. Coverage the setup, why players will still join, why this helps the teams win, and why guarantees the long-term financial stability of the club. First of all, setup. What these incentives what are like the team's incentives or like the incentives of the managers? Firstly, to win. Why? Because like they like care about the sport, they're like probably invested in the sport, and then also like, there's like money if you win. Second of all, like the long-term financial stability and success. What does it look like? It looks like making sure like you're long-term success as well. What does it look like? It's like referring to like win top 4 consistently rather than like just winning the league once and getting relegated. And this is very important. And also, secondly, the long-term ability of success. Why? Because there's like business incentives to do well. Secondly, like football financial fair plays or other like sports money's law, but then also the fact that like that's like the thing that they're scrutinized over, particularly is like if they're going bankrupt, they're the one who gets like the blame. What does it look like? So a couple of things. First of all, individual metrics, like primary, you can like goals on the assists, but believes that this is probably going to operate like advanced analytics, which can like actually reflect their performance and reflect their contribution to the team. Then secondly, like primary, just like team outcomes, i.e. if you make top 4, you get paid more. If you like win the league, you get paid more. If you win the make finals, you get paid more. Then also just like winning, like if you win the game, if you like get a certain amount of points, you get money, or like if you win that game, you get the win. Thirdly, just like this like primary like would like doesn't really occur for superstars. Why? Because they're just like all like such a prestigious like nature. I.e. Mbappe has like heaps of bargaining power, but we live like most places. The club are bigger than the player. I.e. Benzema, who like won the Ballon d'Or and played like big players, still like not as big as Real Madrid, and Real Madrid will have like the bargaining power. Okay, why would they join? This won't be all preempted to like if they claim that they won't be fine. First of all, optimism bias. Players think they do well. Why is this the case? Firstly, they're like pretty confident. They think that they're the best. That's how they got to the level. That's how they got to the top leagues, and they also like overlook other things like injury because they're incredibly self-confident and very like optimistic. So they're like if they're saying like, oh, if you score X Y amount of goals or like you have this performance, they probably believe that they're going to do it. They're going to back themselves. Then second, and also note as well, like if they like don't back themselves, you probably don't want them on the team because you want players who like think they're the best, think they're going to succeed. Secondly, teams have a lot more balance, as I said in setup. What this looks like is firstly like often it's like big players are buying young clubs. And then secondly, it means like most clubs are like bigger than the players because a lot of these big organisations. Also note that then also secondly, academy players who like have their friends, they like the team, have supported the team since they're young kids, so like they want to play for the team. Then also note the fact like that this is like what we refer like this would obviously apply to like all managers, which means if like Chelsea, if you don't want to play for Chelsea because they're only doing bonus incentives, well every other manager is likely to do it. So like even if we like don't prove structurally as to why players won't join, it's like not relevant anyway. Okay, therefore players joined and like so we get like heaps of buy-in anyway and the same buy-in that they're going to claim. Okay, why did it improve the performance? And this is like the most important thing of the debate because like managers like primarily want to win. Note that like sport isn't a great business opportunity, so they can't like, oh, money also helps us. But yeah, players want to win. Okay, why is this the case? First of all, they need to consistently perform to get paid because it's going to be like massive incentives. What does this look like? You can't like take breaks throughout the season, go on holiday, for example, like Eden Hazard used to do, or like some seasons just like we fully wasn't engaged at Chelsea because why? You don't get paid and you need money in order. And yeah, you can't take it off, and if you do take it off, the club loses less money, so it kind of gets compensated for this. Second of all, there's like a team focus. Why is this the case? Under that status quo where you're only getting paid on a fixed contract, what it looks like is in order to chase other money, the distinguishing factor is stuff like endorsements, which like come from being like the star man. In other words, when we have the advanced metrics evaluating the players or you get bonuses for certain team performances, you're going to like be much more team centered and a lot more buy into the team performances opposed to being selfish. What does that mean? It's like means that that's obviously better because you don't want like players playing individual, i.e. if there's an opportunity to pass the ball to your teammate guaranteed goal or like take the risk to score yourself, if you like wanted the glory, you want the goals because that's the only way you can get extra money, then you're probably going to take one on the opportunity. If you know that, oh, we win the game, I get a bonus plus winning the game, you're going to prioritize the team. Incredibly important for the manager. Thirdly, players want to say, why is this the case? Which is like obviously something the manager would want. Because if they're like achieving like a comfortable level of success, they're unlikely to like take on a new challenge, take on a big risk. Why? Because like leagues are very different. Often, if you go and like play football in England and you're very successful, then you go over to Spain, the different styles of play means you might not fit in. So therefore, you'll be like less likely to take the risk and more likely to just stay at the club and like be comfortable achieving level of success. And this also notes for like many players who are doing well, getting money anyway, which like is the players that the sports manager would want to keep. Thirdly, you don't want to be injured, or if you do get injured, you want to return. Why is this the case? Obviously, if you return, you can get paid more, you can get on the pitch. This is incredibly important because you do off season, you take more care of your body, you do like extra training, but then also if you do get injured, you like engage in rehab more, you like do those extra drills to make sure you are fully fit. And yeah, this is incredibly important. Fourthly, you can give opportunities to young people. Why is this the case? Because you take the risk on signing. What does it look like? It looks like signing Madrid. If the risk doesn't come off, as it hasn't come off so far, it is absolutely fine because he only gets paid 70k. But if they do succeed and they do reach their potential, you'll be able to get them compensated. No, but it's like a player with a lot of hype, a lot of value, they're probably going to get paid. Be like paid a reasonable fee, but if you get them on the incentive-based bonus, it means that if they don't live up to that hype, you're perfectly fine, and it means that you're paying them adequately. Fifthly, players train more. Why? Because they get more money, but then they also get more buy-in and training. So what does it look like? Firstly, just like in training, you're like more engaged and more focused on what you do. Why? Because you want to improve yourself, you want the team to do better, but then it also looks like doing other outside training. Note, Mudrik, who is on this contract, does his training. He takes extra practice shots after because he knows that if he scores, he knows that if he plays well, he's like has a certain the advanced analytics means that performance is like being a high level, he's going to get paid more. But then also it looks like you can put like specific training metrics in the contract players who don't play well. What does it look like? Eden Hazard or Cancelo, who are like notably bad trainees and don't really engage. You can be like, okay, well, you have to like run a certain amount of kilometers in training, or you have to like have this sort of level of performance of training, so they're going to get that buy-in. Lastly, you can build a contract around your team's ideology. What does it look like? It looks like Liverpool wanting to play a high-pressing game of football, and Man City want to play a high-pressing game of football, so you have a certain amount of pressing intensity. It looks like England, who want to play basketball, play aggressive cricket, you need like a certain strike rate, or like a certain like level of aggressiveness that can be evaluated by advanced analytics. Why is this good? A, because like you feel like a bit of power as a manager you kind of control, but then also just like fits in with your vision. What does it mean? A, the team performs better. B, you get like a stable income. C, you just become more popular because the team is performing better, which is just overall good for the long-term success. Not just like winning or doing better on the pitch like wins the bet on its own. Okay, lastly, how does it ensure the long-term financial stability of the team? First of all, revenue is performance-based, and if like the income isn't cost up performance-based, it's incredibly harmful. Why? You do worse, then like you get like kind of screwed on by financial laws or FFP, you get like relegated, but you have to still play for Premier League salary. This is going to be incredibly harmful. Second of all, if your player gets injured, it means that for like a long term, it means that you're going to have to pay them. Note that like they probably don't think that they want to get injured, so this isn't like a reason that's why they aren't going to join as a bit of preemptive. For also fourthly or thirdly, it forces players who are dead and like or dead with a flop. Will have to stick around. What does it look like? It looks like Bakayoko, who signed for Chelsea, but was terrible and gets paid 150k, just chilling for like 5 years, like going on loan for a little bit and still getting paid. No, he doesn't want to leave because no team's going to pay him that much. Under us as Macquarie, he's getting paid less, so teams are happy to match it, or if he is sticking around, he gets paid. So proud to affirm to win the league.
This Chelsea example from side Affirmative, if not being very telling, is also very damning, given that Chelsea is probably one of the worst financial managers in the Premier League, paid $300 million this season, only to lose to Fulham and Crystal Palace, as I mentioned earlier. They're third bottom of the table. I think if they want to use that example, they should get the automatic loss. Two things in terms of setup. Firstly, in terms of prioritization, we would just think this is almost exclusive, as in that's how the debate operates. So on our side, we have one or two incentive-based financial contracts. On their side, they have one or two like stable fixed contracts. Secondly, in terms of the threshold of like how their model works, we think this is probably a range of different performance metrics. If they want to claim this random fugazi of advanced analytics, sure, but this is just goals, the amount of tackles you have, mileages run, stuff like that. But on the extreme side, stuff like league wins or amount of points or getting the top of the table. Though we would know empirically in the status quo that probably exists in fixed contracts anyways. Like every professional sports player in the NBA, in the NBL, NFL, probably in the majority of instances probably have that anyways. Two arguments then: why we get better financial management, and secondly, why we get better recruitment, better players, and better leagues. On financial management, two notes. Firstly, obviously, clubs are relatively self-interested for their board and their owners, but two specific notes. This is often a prerequisite for reinvestment, i.e. you need to be a good financial management with good liquidity and enough wealth in order to reinvest into your club and buy players. And secondly, wealth often heavily correlates but is not causational for success. So that is to say, stability often allows for you to risk maximize for one or two star players to get that edge of pay for Haaland, for example, whatever the fuck, right? Secondly, in terms of financial management, we would note that beyond the implication that this has on having a good balance sheet and good liquidity and stuff like that, we think the impact of this is probably in regards to foresight and general predictability and stability. At the point at which it is fixed, I think the intuitive link there is just things are more predictable in terms of costs and stuff like that. Though I would make a few notes. Firstly, in terms of the unpredictability of sports, which is to say much more than any other industry, maybe outside of stocks. Sport is probably the most unstable industry you can operate in because injuries could just completely nuke your season, like it did for Chelsea and Man U. It could just be incredibly unpredictable in order to win. Look at Arsenal; they were winning for so fucking long and they just blew their lead. And then there are just a bunch of random factors which contribute to you losing. Which is to say, if you believe this argument, where it is possible to minimize your risk and maximize your stability in terms of your balance sheets, because it is so difficult to do in sports, this is likely the most important thing and probably correlates with higher spending and stuff like that. Why is it true that we get better financial management? Firstly, just more intuitively, you just get better and less unstable fluctuation at the point at which the amount of money you have to pay every single season, or even every single week, every single game, doesn't have to change by the millions as it does on their side. Because if suddenly one of your players on Chelsea goes on a 10, scores 3 goals or whatever, and beats shit house, right? Then you have to pay the extra salary and whatever. Cool. Let's engage with some of the fake mecs they have. They talk about optimism bias. I think this is symmetric across every single league, i.e. sports players all have optimism bias. They all think they're going to win. They all think they're really good. They're all going to play. That's why they're professional sports players. Chelsea invest $300 million because they think they have a shot of winning the league or whatever. Secondly, in regards to advanced analytics, I just think this is the same thing as epistemic assays. I don't think the average visible adjudicator just knows what this is. I don't think they can rely on that as their sole mechanism to be able to determine, oh, they're being selfless and all of this shit. Cool. Secondly, in regards to form and success, as I flagged to you earlier, obviously particularly unstable, particularly prone to things like injuries, but beyond that, stuff like age, just things like psychological, roadblocks or whatever, or just having a lull in your season, or just being unable to play for a myriad of weird reasons like superstitions and stuff like that. That just means that it is often external to the player's control how well they play. For the same reason, they probably want to win, they probably want to do well, because that means they'll probably get a better contract or go to a better club or just, win for the club. At the point at which they are unable to do that in the status quo, it probably just means that there's a myriad of reasons outside of the profit incentive that means that they can't. Thirdly, in regards to financial restrictions and structures, I don't think it's true that they get better alliance to the structures of payment, because at the point at which you have salary caps in most industries and most sports leagues, it's probably particularly difficult to meet those caps and just predict how much you have to pay. At the point at which the fluctuating costs that you have under their side is something that is much more difficult to account for on their side than it is comparatively to ours. And at the point at which this is the predominant incentive on their side or whatever, it means two things. Firstly, in terms of fluctuating incentives, you have to price set how much you actually have to pay. So you have to expect how much you have to pay in terms of the incentives and stuff like that, which means you pay a much lower base price. It also means that you're unlikely to price set for things like support staff and stuff like that. Secondly, in regards to maxing out, just because sports clubs must be risk averse in order to maximize their stability and be liquid, right? They have to minimize the amount of money they give, also because they want to maximize their profits. But it just means that they're unlikely to engage in the best version of incentives, so they want to give the least amount of incentives on their sides. That just means you increase the margin of error under their side. So 3 impacts. Firstly, You just maximize certainty and predictability in what is essentially a very unstable and unpredictable industry. Secondly, this allows you to maximize your one-off purchases in terms of getting those dynasties and making sure your role players like maintain and stay there. We would also know that, sorry, I should have done this in setup, but like most like sports leagues are built by role players and stuff like that. Thirdly, it allows for liquidity management. Weighing. Even if AF gets some of this, we get a much more, it's much harder to do on their side. That's probably a good thing. Cool, let's talk about the second argument about recruitment and plays and stuff like that. I have a bunch of setup on characterization. Firstly, players probably play for this anyways, insofar as like they have maximal priority of certainty insofar as their own legacy and their own, I guess, career is very, very unstable because you don't actually, play for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. The ability to access longevity, we would say in sports, is often a privilege that is only accessed by GOATs. It is not, something that can be accessed by the, defensive role player or like whatever, right? Secondly, we would say that the success is often fluctuating based on the success of the team, and it's probably like the real preference finally of players to be stable and like perform stably over like 10 years in a long-term trajectory, given that like being a sports person is a relatively relatively short and unstable career path. Cool. Second piece of setup or characterization in regards to the average player. We would know that most players on the average professional team, which is below Div 1, are not like LeBron James or like Erling Haaland, right? Like in the Lakers and even in Manchester City, they have a bunch of role players, a bunch of players who just sit on the bench or just come in for a few minutes to do their job. Most of the players are not like superstars who are like heavily incentivized by these profits and stuff like that. Secondly, in regards to like these professional teams, there's just a bunch of like lower division professional teams that this probably applies to as well, like Div 2, Div 3, whatever, relegation leagues, all of that stuff. Third piece of characterization setup. Players probably rarely need these excess incentives for the simple reason that like they've trained for like the past 15 years, so they probably have an incentive to play well and like win and all of that stuff I mentioned before. So it's unclear that like getting $100,000 more at the point at which you're getting paid like $500,000 a week is the tipping point there. And finally, clubs prioritize this consistency in this legacy at the point at which you need to think about the next 30 years rather than just winning the league in the next year. Cool. Why does this happen? Because players, for 4 reasons, are much more likely to just play well. Firstly, because you get better stability and stuff like that. This probably means that you get the paycheck, you know what you're doing. Secondly, you get a far more supportive cultural environment at the point at which those players who don't play well are often egregiously punished on their side. Thirdly, we explained that individual stat padding probably happens a lot more because if you get paid to score a goal, you're much less likely to pass from the tap in and take the chance risk of maybe missing. That's why we win more. That's why we get better financial management. So powerful.
Let's be really clear in this debate. If Chelsea, or rather any Premier League club, didn't have a sort of relegation clause which meant that when they get relegated they can pay their players less money, it would literally mean in all instances when they get relegated, they would no longer be able to meet financial fair play rules and would literally end their club, right? Because now they're paying people exorbitant amount of fees that they signed on long-term contracts, which means now that when they no longer have the revenue to make this money, they can no longer survive as a club. Because under the regulations that exist, they would be paying more money than they bring in, which is illegal. And note here, the Prem is a pretty big example, but the reality is in all instances where leagues have sort of salary caps, this sort of thing and this sort of issue exists in every single instance. Because notably in clubs like the NBA, the NFL, and the NRL, etc., if your star player gets hurt, who is on a long-term contract and takes up a big percentage of your salary cap, it means you're literally screwed for the next 10 years. Because notably, when LeBron James gets injured, for 10 years you have to pay his contract, and because that means you're no longer able to use that money to spend on other players, the entire time that contract exists, you are literally like existing in the squalor of not making the playoffs every single year because the salary cap does not allow it. And I think what this means is a couple things. It means one, you're unable to make a lot of money financially, which literally ruins your club. But two, it just means you suck for 10 years. And this is something we ought to avoid as a sort of management. A couple things I'll do in this speech. First, I'll talk about who gets better financial management and why it's clearly us. And then we'll talk about things like recruitment and play environment and who gets better long-term outcomes for the club, which I think we're pretty ahead on in any way. They say a couple things at first, which is to say, first of all, you get less unstable fluctuation when you have fixed contracts. But the thing that I want to point out here is that the fluctuation is literally resulting from success, which is something that clubs are willing and able to incorporate, which is to say when your players do well, when your clubs do well, and when everyone hits the advanced metrics that we talk about, it means you're just more likely to be scoring more goals, you're more likely to be getting more points, and you're more likely to be doing well, which means you're willing to cop the extra cost that you have to pay here. And I would point out what this means is that when you are playing well, it means you do better and you bring in more revenue because of a couple metrics, which is to say, one, you're more likely to qualify for things like the Champions League, which means you increase the revenue streams that exist. But two, it's more likely that people are likely to come and watch your games and buy tickets and do things like buy jerseys and other forms of merchandise, which increases the revenue that exists. And which is something to say that you're probably just making more money when you do well. But the third thing is it just means that your club is worth more money, which is to say when you are the management and the ownership group, if you are winning more games, it means the club goes up from being worth $500 million to possibly up to $2 billion, which is something that notably happens all the time in these fluctuating markets, which is to say even if the costs are going up, you're more than able to accept those costs going up because of the increase it gives to your valuation as a club. And note here, I would say that clubs are pretty smart and will know what they are able and willing to risk. The only example you can probably give in sports where clubs were unable to do this is the example in F1 of Lotus, but I would say in all other instances of sports existing and these contracts being signed, which is notably the status quo and incredibly prevalent, clubs are able to determine how much money they're willing to spend and what level of incentives they can exist without going bankrupt, and they have the incentive and the noticeable capacity to do so. Then the next thing they say is it's hard to predict cost caps, and when there's things like the salary cap, you are unable to account for this because if all your players do well, you then go over the salary cap. And the first thing I would note here is that empirically most leagues have a level of flexibility that exists in this mechanism, which is to say in the NBA, when a player scores a certain amount of points or makes the All-NBA league, which is notably when they get more money under these contracts, this is explicitly allowed under the collective bargaining agreement that the league puts in place, which is to say when you make the All-Pro team, you're able to get paid more money and that does not account to your salary, which is something that literally all forms of player bargaining, collective bargaining agreements that the players put in place, argue all the time for, because the players who have control of these collective bargaining agreements and the player unions that exist want these incentives to be able to be activated because it just means that they get more money, and that's something that literally, structurally, all clubs want to, all players want to have access to. But the second thing I would say here is that in instances of examples like F1, when drivers have extra money that they get per point, that's something that the league actively wants to incentivize and allows, and it's something that that in most leagues empirically they are able to do. But the second thing I'd say here is that even in instances where this is not true, and probably the only example that they can give of an actually fixed example of a salary cap is in the NRL, there are very easy ways to get around this, which is to say the first way that they do this is they create pools of money that the bonuses come out of, which is a fixed amount of money, and then it's just how these bonuses are distributed is based on incentives. So it's very easy to predict how much money you're paying because it's in the fixed amount in the pool. It's just dependent on who gets this money that's based on this on the incentives. But the second thing we'd say here is that there are just often ways that players can get around this. So in instances of small scale breaches of the salary cap, you can find a sponsor to get around it who's you're not directly paying them, but someone else is. It's just very hard to do this for high amounts of money under the salary cap. Which is say at the end of this, it's pretty clear that financial management is not something that is an issue, but notably in examples of relegation and promotion, it's something that is incredibly beneficial for these clubs. In instances where a player gets injured, you no longer have to squalor in the depths of not making the playoffs for 10 years, and that's something we all support. But and this is something that's incredibly impactful and something that we ought to support. Moving on. Why you don't lose players and why the team environment doesn't get worse. Notably, all of Toby's mechs still stand here. They say optimism bias isn't a real thing, but notably we think it is. Players join these clubs on the belief that they will do well because they think that they'll do well because they are incredibly confident in their ability. They will join these teams thinking they will do well, and it does just increase the bargaining power that you have. And notably, the competition mechs between there's a high amount of competition between players, and clubs literally have all the bargaining power because there are few clubs and many players. So this is something that does exist and does give more incentives for these people to join these clubs, they say, well, players don't need extra incentives, and most players aren't superstars who can bargain for this. We think in all instances where you're able to offer extra incentives, it just means you're able to increase your desirability to these players. And when you are a club that exists and you are marginally the same as all other clubs in your league, and you do about the same, and there's no real differentiating factors, your ability to offer incentives just makes you look slightly better, and that's something that will get the players that you want to join, and that is incredibly impactful. But the third thing we'd say here is that it just means that you are able to take more risks, which is something that means you can sign a bunch of players who are young on small contracts and have high incentives in the future, which they think they will be able to hit, which means in 5 years' time, if they are incredibly good, you've now signed them early, you had the first mover advantage, and you get these really good players that you then pay more money in the future, which is something that's incredibly good for you, because now you've got access to, when the players had little ability to bargain for themselves, you've got access to these really good players that ended up being much better in the long run, which means your team is better. Why doesn't it ruin the environment? Which is something that they bring up in the last dying seconds of their speech. A couple things here. The first thing to say is all players are on similar contracts, and in most instances, if the team does well, you do well, so there's not much delta here, because when you get paid more money, the team's doing well, so everyone gets paid more money. But the second thing we say is players who are already doing well are already observable. Everyone knows who's scoring goals, and you get jealous anyway, because notably they get the endorsement deals and they get more monies outside of this, so this doesn't really change anything. But the third thing is that competition makes probably get better. Advantage metrics means you still pass, but it just means now you train harder because you want to get access to the more money in your contract. But the fourth thing we'd say here is it's probably just worse than the alternative. Because note here, in Chelsea's environment, everyone hated Pepper because he got paid 300k a week, despite being bad. On our side, at least it's better off because now that person gets paid less money, so there isn't that sort of hatred for players who are getting paid more than you. These reasons perhaps with
Good. Problem with this affirmative team is it relies on a very unilateral conception of how sports teams function. That's to say that, everyone will do well, and so the clubs will get lots of success and can pay everyone lots of money. Or everyone does badly, and that doesn't matter because the clubs can save lots of money. The problem is, this is extraordinarily unnuanced. The average sports team was not a team that was coming first or wooden spooning. It was a team that was sitting somewhere in the middle. We had some players that were likely to be doing very, very well, and some that were not. And the problem that has for this entire team's conception of debate is that maximizes all of the unpredictability that we explained. That it makes it incredibly difficult to do things like planning when within that middle range you have no idea season to season, game to game where you sit, you have no idea how to plan for the future, you have no idea which players are going to come good, and at that point you have that uncertainty. It's extraordinarily difficult for clubs to win, it's extraordinarily difficult for them to make decisions. That's why it will take the lead. 3 questions then in the speech. Firstly, financial well-being. Secondly, which side creates better incentives for players to join these clubs in the first place, and finally looking at professional success for clubs themselves. I'm going to start with the financial well-being stuff and really quickly respond with frankly a bunch of very frivolous responses they give, trying to kind of lock us out by saying that the fixed price contracts we give are going to be particularly bad. The first thing they say is they screwed over regulation. One, we observed with relegation. One, we just observed when clubs are relegated, players often jump ship because the contracts often come void. But secondly, when teams drop down, there are often already clauses in place when this happens, so players like to leave in those situations, likely be in the contracts. It's unclear why we have to support this particular set of things and they do not. This seems uncomparatively silly. Second thing is now you have to keep paying players when they're injured. Obviously, again, one, not how this works. Unclear why that's a differential in this debate. Presumably, you're either not playing players on either side, or you're paying them on either side, in which case it is probably good they get paid relatively more money. And also, unclear what the harm is at the point you were expecting to play for these players anyway, so they play one game, get injured at the start of the season, that's a cost you already knew was coming. So, assuming even on it's true that it only happens on our side, unclear the substantial amount of harm, which means that all their material just these contracts will screw you over is just untrue and uncomparative. And I encourage you to just view this probably applies to everything they say in their debate, or would already be modeled out through things like contract regulations, aside from the specific pay structure that exists on both sides already. Let's then look at their actual responses on financial well-being. The first thing they suggest is that fluctuations from success is fine, because you can just cop the cost if you win because you're winning. 5 responses to this. The first thing to say is, contrary to what they say, it actually just is really hard to do things like avoid salary caps in this. Because notably, clubs are extraordinarily unlikely to assume the scenario of every single player plays well every game and you are maxing out the amount of money, because it's extraordinarily statistically improbable, which means they're likely to assume far, far lower. So in the cases where this does happen, at least with our salaries caps, you're actually just screwed over at that side. Obviously, fairly small set of team clubs, but that is a particularly large impact at the point that actually has huge consequences for these clubs that I'm likely to want to deal with. The second thing is just that it's unclear why this substantially boosts revenue streams. Their logic here is, oh, well, the Champions League exists and you can get invited to that. Obviously, it does not exist for the majority of sports leagues around the world. For many clubs, the only benefit you get from winning is if you win overall, you get money. But the problem is that obviously you can have lots of players be incentivized to do well and play very well, but still not win, which means you're just incurring a very large cost. But it's unclear there's any extra cost you get to benefit from that. And even in the case of like the Champions League, they never do a way up of explaining why this is actually financially worth it for you. Because obviously maybe it's worth for you in one season, but the point that probably relies on you being able to make success in future seasons as well, which they're not able to explain. Thirdly, we just say predictability across the year is far more important. That's to say at the point where you know everything you're going to pay, you can do things like invest in good support structures. You can do things like make sure you pay an appropriate amount for things like physio. You can do things like more Moneyball styles, team selection where you can pay for players in specific roles and less reliant on very incentive-based models, which suggests that the actual amount of financial modulation you get on outside is far smaller, and clubs are probably likely to prefer that level of consistency over just hoping they'll be able to take the costs. Finally, it's just like the payments for these clubs do not happen consistently. That's to say they want to base this on lots of individual metrics, which means you can have a huge payout for one game and a tiny payout for another game, which means the fact you do not know how much money you're going to have to pay for any individual game actually forces clubs to be incredibly liquid and have the ability to pay players all the time, which constrains their ability to do other things, for example, like investment and other types of things, or engaging in more long-term sports projects. So they always need lots of capital. The off instance things go badly, which actually massively constrains the amount of financial calculus these teams make, makes their financial well-being far worse. The second logic is like, oh, well, clubs are smart and know when to risk. One, as I've already explained, they're not going to expect to pay all of these huge bonuses at the same time. Two, it massively increases the potential financial burden on these clubs because of that level of unpredictability, which is probably bad. But thirdly, I would just suggest that the incentives they have on their side actively encourage bad decision making. Point clubs care lots about winning. They are likely to do things like, for example, over-leverage themselves on contracts because they want to do very, very well, on the hope that at least some of those players will come good just so they can get them in. But at the point where all of them succeed, it's likely that these clubs just do end up not having the money to pay all of them, because as they themselves say, these clubs want to win, and so they're far more likely to do that kind of over-leveraging when there's ambiguity about how much they're going to have to pay at the end of the season, whereas it's something they're very unlikely to do on our side. The logic of Ollie of like, oh, well, they're taking more risk is actually really, really bad at the point it means these clubs just make decisions that end up screwing them over. Which is to say that if you care about financial stability, probabilistically, there are a set of clubs on their side that would act really, really harmfully, screw over their players in themselves. It was far less likely to happen on our side. For all the reasons we explained to Isaac that still in this debate have not gotten direct response yet. Let's turn to the question of which side better incentivizes its players to join these clubs. Because notably, they kind of hinge their entire path to victory in this debate on these clubs being more competitive and playing better, but this is obviously conditional on you having players of equal quality or better quality than our side. So the point we explained that's not the case, we simply take the debate. There are three incentives they explain as to why they do well. First is optimism bias. These players will perform. One, obviously, optimism bias does not exist in a vacuum. Players often do weigh this up against risk of like whether or not they will actually perform. But secondly, I would just say this applies either exclusively to young, inexperienced players who have not, for example, gone through things like form slump or had particularly long careers. Because once you've gone through a season where you've just eaten shit one time, it's really hard for you to like then be willing to take on a contract where you might get paid practically zero money for a pretty large portion of the year. Especially because of the fact that, as they themselves explain, clubs wanting to be like super ambitious means their base rate here is likely to be very, very low on their side. So the risk individual players take is likely to be very, very large. The other group who probably doesn't care about this is like the stars who always do well. But they literally say they'll give them fixed contracts, so this clearly falls out of the debate. Which means I think this suggests if optimism bias is why they're willing to take these risk-based contracts, it applies to a very small set of players, but not to players who want to, for example, maximize the amount of time they have in their sports career, noting all the characteristics in Isaac's speech to suggest that you can't be in the game for that long, you don't know when your career is going to end. Those are all the sorts of things that mean you want to prioritize things like stability and knowing how much money you get, and that risk-taking is something that actively harms your financial future. Their second two responses are like, oh, loyalty to clubs, which obviously is symmetric, and finally, like all clubs do this, which notably not how an active debate works. Obviously, this is like an individual sports club, which they should do. They can't just be like, well, every sports club would do this and you would have no choice. I think in a world where both exist, you're far more likely for players to opt into our side. But we'd also just, as for reasons I've already explained, clubs would be likely to screw players over in their role. So when you consider we offer stability and honestly just higher base rates, which they haven't responded to, we've given incentives to suggest it's likely to be quite a bit lower on their side because they're going to want to leverage their players into performing, which encourages them to make it as low as possible for these players. That means players will be far more likely to join clubs on our side. Finally then, let's look at the professional success, which is already mitigated by a prior clash, but now is about to be knocked out of the debate. They're like, oh, players will now perform because in fact their pay is directly tied to it. But sports players already have maximal incentive to perform. For the reasons they identify, you get things like sponsorships from that. You get things like better future contracts from that with other teams. You care about the sport, it is your career. You obviously want to do well. So at the point this incentive is already maximized, the question is actually whether this raises capacity, where it obviously doesn't. We explain in Isaac's speech why things like form are often ambiguous, often not things players can control. They cannot control their own psychological state to the extent there are often external factors that might impact their performance, like for example the death of their family member. And that's and also just the fact this would increase the amount of pressure on players to perform extraordinarily high. And lots of players just do not perform under pressure. That is not a skill everyone has. Which suggests then they're likely to create the type of environment that means that players are not for more, but in anything far more stress. Which then leads to our next argument when we explain that the culture's going to be really bad. Because the more players are constantly stressed, they claim there's a wide variety of individual metrics that are going to justify these contracts. But notably, the thing that most within your control is your individual performance. So when you have a chance to score the goal, you know that will increase your salary and you take it. You cannot individually control the entirety of the team's performance, and so that encourages the type of self-centered decision making that means that teams often do actually just perform worse. It means that individual players are constantly comparing themselves to others and seeing that every goal that someone else scores is a goal that they could have scored and maximize their salary instead of someone else's. It creates clubs that are far more self-interested, far less likely to succeed. For those reasons, so proud to oppose.
I'll take off a mask for the sake of the recording. Just also protection. In the early 2000s or 2010s, I'm not so sure, Oakland Athletics was able to have massive success in the MLB because they targeted players based on certain statistics. That meant teams had lost players who were performing quite well. And these were statistics that everyone had access to, which these teams could have shored up. They had paid them more based on the statistics, which allowed Oakland Athletics to go 20 wins without a loss, though unfortunately we missed out on the end. Or a more recent example, it allowed for Nongshim Red Force, a Korean League of Legends esport team, allowed them to have two teams in the same role, and they could sub them out between games if one underperformed, like they did, I think, yesterday night or 2 nights ago, where Quad underperformed, they could sub him out. And they could take that cost because they could pay Quad less because he wasn't performing as much. And so it meant then that you could put in a better player, you could take the risk with a less player, and you could have more success into the long run. Empirical examples of how paying your team well or paying them based on performance meant that you could pay players and you could get the success that you wanted. 2 questions in this speech, fairly obvious. Firstly, a question about financial management. Secondly, a question about team success. Firstly, a question about financial management. The big push from this negative team is that you get better financial management. However, this was a somewhat odd push that was self-defeated by their own characterization, because they explained that sports is ultra unpredictable, that people are unlikely to perform. This is due to uncertainty, things like injuries, things like just they're in a bit of a slump. Under our side, we can pay them less. We have more money, we are more stable. We have comparatively more money, more stability in the future in them. And this explains that because I give the analysis that this instability is likely to be on a large scale. That means on this large scale, we have more money for those injured players, for those players who aren't playing as well. That means we aren't forking out as much cost. So on comparative, we're a team that is better. This is analysis we give to you at Toby, that they don't respond down the bench. And so this was defeating for their team. Let's deal with their individual mechanisms and assume that you don't buy this analysis. Their first push is fluctuating costs. However, this is reliant on the characterization that teams are stupid. Fluctuating costs might exist, but they never explain why teams can't account for this. I argue that teams probably can account for this for 3 reasons. Firstly, they can just set aside a portion of the budget. For example, whatever the salary cap is, and they can meet that. Then that ensures they'll always have the money at the end of the day. Secondly, they have so much information on these players, all of their training, and they collect this information for things like training purposes, for things like coaching purposes. This is the information that you'll use then to pay these players. So that means you're likely to be pretty aware of how these players have been performing in the past, how they do perform into the future. And so it means that I think you could just fairly accurately predict these things. There's a reason why things like insurance exist. Insurance is an incredibly complicated, fluctuating, uncertain thing, but they can make insane amounts of money in insurance because they have all this information to predict these things. I argue that it's somewhat symmetric, and so the point of insurance existing defeats these mechanisms from this negative team. But thirdly, there are just experienced individuals, things like accountants, who I argue can just predict these things. And so not only does this defeat the fluctuating costs, but it defeats the over-leveraging. Yes, I guess at best, this might be mitigation, but this mitigation was incredibly important because at the point where you believe this fluctuating cost is likely to be small, then that explains that a lot of their benefits about stability aren't important because they need a big win on stability to win the debate. To win the debate here. The other pushes that they then have at second, second negative. Let me see if I have it here. I don't think I have the sheet here. So the other pushes, I'll just do some mitigation while I find my point. This issue is likely to be unimportant for two reasons. Firstly, owners can just shore up costs. Because at the point where you believe that, like in the sense that owners and things like the Saudi government or Saudi Arabia and other big firms pay these firms, right? They can just shore up the cost of any loss of money that occurs at any fluctuation cost. And they have the incentive to do this because investing in sports is a long-term image thing. So if you can have more success into the future and you can build up your team, that means you can get more sponsorships, more advertising, more money to secure your costs. It was never about a short-term thing. You're always thinking about the long-term. We thought that you were willing to pay to trade this off into the into the long-term. And then but secondly, it's a short-term thing and it's a pretty small harm. The mitigation explains that you're likely to that this harm's likely to be smaller and traded off. So at the end of this debate, if you believe then that we can prove that the team perform better, that means that more fans flock to you. You get more things like and then you can get things like prize money and prize pools for performing better. Things that looks like jersey sales or jersey sales for your team, which means you can earn money. But thirdly, long-term things like ads and sponsors. Some of the pushes that they have as second negative are like things. Firstly, on their relegation, they argue that people jump ship or compact changes. However, what we argue to you is that at the point where you're getting relegated, everyone's underperforming. So you can pay these people comparatively less under our side as well. That means then that we can the cost of moving to the relegation is less under our side. We can better account for this stuff. So we account for the worst case scenario and we're better in the worst case scenario when you do underperform, which they explain is likely to occur. And so at that point, you should be hedging your risk in that thing. You care about hedging your risk because they explain it's a dangerous endeavor. On the thing of saying injure, they argue that it's good to get them paid more. But no, this is the incentives of the management, and the incentives of the management, if someone's not being productive, you want to pay them less so you can afford to pay someone else, especially with things like salary caps. If someone's injured, you can just hire someone else and you can pay them a good enough amount where you don't have to worry about salary caps and you can have that sub in. Things with fluctuations, they argue that it's hard to avoid salary caps. But the problem is that these teams want to avoid the banner of the worst case, the hammer of the worst case scenario. Again, we argue they're going to be pretty good at predicting these things. Then finally, they explain that you prefer consistency because it means that you can account for other things like investment. Firstly, the counterfactual. If you believe that we can have more money at the end of the season if they perform worse, and so that means we can invest more into the future. That means you can improve your team more into the future, and so that's pretty good. But secondly, you can just change the payment. The change in payment is unlikely to be massive. But earlier mitigation means that this is again an unimportant mechanism. But thirdly, if you just if you buy the next, you just pay them less. That means you can invest more under our side, which is probably pretty good. So I think we've deleted all this stuff on financial management. Explains it's unimportant. So let's explain then, move on to the second issue, one of winning. Why do you think winning was the most important thing? Firstly, people probably went into the management of sport teams for cultural reasons. That is, you can earn more money managing things like companies. And so people who bought into managing sports probably cared about the winning of sports to a degree. But secondly, also because then that's what wins you in the long term. What pushes do they have? They say under recruitment, you have things like stat padding. Firstly, unclear why that's bad, because the stats we explained to you are likely to be ones that are good and help the team. So if they're stat padding, they're playing better, you're winning more. That's pretty good. Secondly, we argue that there is a team share incentive to win well. That is, if you win, everyone on the team wins. So you're not going to be selfish about it. If you don't take actions which lead to team losses that help yourself, you're going to get paid less. So you have the incentive to work together. They argue that the environment's unlikely to be supportive because people are likely going to be focusing on themselves. But two things to this. Firstly, we explain that we create a system of teamwork which is reliant on team success. You know if you're being selfish, or if you flame, or if you go curse and abuse another player, they're going to perform worse. And so that means you lose more into the long term. The counterfactual is that they earn the same amount under their side. You don't have incentives to care about your teammates. You're more willing to flame them, abuse them, and take these actions if they perform well. But secondly, you also have incentives to perform well in yourself. You get things like sponsorships. You get things like outside of your club contract. And so you have incentives to be selfish in order to be the individual star, to up your bargaining power, to jump ship to another and try and earn more with another company. On role players, we think we can just justify hiring role players more because you can just pay them less if they don't perform. But secondly, if role players are more likely to take contracts because they know that they have the moments that they can earn more money under our side. We also argue that when a team is successful, it's much harder to snipe players and steal players because they're earning more with your team. Earning more with another team is uncertain. So if you have a very good team that wins a championship unexpectedly, like DRX and League of Legends, you are able to keep that team into the future. You can win more into the future, which is good for your team. We also explain that you can take risks on young players because if they underperform, that means you can have more. Then you don't have to pay them, but they can have more success. But you can also take out the bigger players. We have a comprehensive win aside of that.
Team culture was worse in this debate when every time you watched someone else in your team miss a pass or stuff up a kick, it cost you tens of thousands of dollars because your team was unable to score a goal, right? At some point, there was a performance-based metric here. It was likely that you were going to pursue pushing for the try yourself had a 75% chance of success rather than making the pass that had a 90% chance of success. And at the point where there was significant pressure on you to play your best, we think it was just wrong for the other team to suggest these teams would function particularly well. Obviously, this debate turns on who gets better players and who gets better game time. So, let's look at what they say. They say that players' performance improves. They say that pay incentives are particularly good, and their sub-mech is they train more. Notably, on this train more sub-mechanism, you just contractually require players to train a sufficient amount anyway, and in fact, training more is not always useful because the more you train, the more risk for injury you have. But there are 7 specific reasons why players are likely to just play better anyway, right? Firstly, they just love the sport. They genuinely just want to play the game to the best of their possibility. That's why they pursue this as a career. Not all players are Nick Kyrgios, right? Secondly, they are probably just competitive at heart. There's a reason you pursue competitive sport. It's because you want to win. It's that fire inside you that drives you to go out there every weekend and leave every last drop of sweat, blood, and tears on the field. But thirdly, there was just significant personal pressure, right? They had put decades of time and effort into these games. They wanted to play their best because that's what made them feel really good. And probably also their family putting pressure on them to provide for them or do certain things or have success in these sports, right? But fourthly, there was just club and team pressure. When you were in these communities, they wanted you to perform anyway, regardless of whether you got paid more or not. Those things were sufficient there. But fifthly, there was probably social media, fan, and media pressure in general. All of those things. Whether you wanted to perform well because you didn't want to be ridiculed on social media in the coming days, that sort of thing was likely to work. Sixthly, right, you just have long-term job and career pressure. You wanted to be able to have contracts in the long term. You wanted to be able to continue to play the game or jump to other teams who would pay you more. That meant you were still likely to play particularly well. And seventhly, you get sponsors and endorsement contracts if you play particularly well. They say this creates a bad team culture. Obviously, this was uncomparative on both sides when you both had these, but they added an extra thing to create division within teams, right? At that point, players have more than enough reason to play to the best of their ability, and we definitely got better recruitment. But let's look at the other reasons they say that players perform better. They tell you that players will prioritise the team. Obviously, players actually have an incentive to prioritise their own incentives. That is, they have an incentive to play the game in a way that looks towards what makes them the most money, so what best fulfills their KPIs or whatever their metrics are. They then tell you that players have it incentivizes risk-taking by players. No, and players are unlikely to take a risk in a new league if it is unclear how much money they're going to make from that. If you can just lock them in a good fat paycheck, they are more likely to take a risk in switching your league to playing from the Italian league to the German league or whatever they wanted to say there, right? And they tell you that you get a better response to injury. Obviously, that did not occur under a side where when you went back out, you were likely to make less while you were still recovering from that injury. You were more likely to respond to injury in a smart and safe way where your play and your play field was guaranteed, right? And it gave you time and confidence to return. They also tell you that you get ideology building, right? At that point, it just turns on winning, right? Notably, their best case scenario under their next of why players were likely to play better was built on a scenario where a club is taking a risk on an unknown player and we're now able to not have to pay a big contract if they weren't going to be well. Notably, for the majority of players in your league and the majority of the players that you as a manager are hiring, they are known knowns. You know what their statistics are, you know what they're going to do, they are going to play fairly well. We think also, at the point where your players are under specifically significant pressure to play particularly well, we think it's particularly harmful, and our response to the fact that pressure is good for this place is no, it probably just likely leads to them doing a bunch of bad stuff, like doing performance enhancing drugs, and those are things that were particularly harmful. But we told you specifically you were able to recruit much better players. Why then was that the case? We told you that you have massively better stability. You told you you have massively better culture when everyone knew what they were getting paid, when everyone was able to plan their lives around that. They tell you that more incentive meant you got better recruitment because players that played better wanted to come because they thought they could do really, really well at your club. Under their characterization where all clubs are doing this thing, actually offering a fixed price contract is a point of differentiation, and that is how you attract players to your club. But secondly, right, they had a minimal comparative, and when every club offered you incentives, offering players slightly better incentives was fairly marginal, but also stability was what was wanted by the majority of players. Most players were in a position in their career where they understood that actually they were just likely to need a locked-in contract for the next 2, 3, 5 years. That meant they could get paid, they could put away some lump sums and have some savings for when they had to retire eventually. They didn't want the risk. And this meant as a manager, you had best access to those players. You could offer them the best contracts by prioritizing those things. You were better able to engage with them. They tell you, and that's particularly important there. At the end of that, what you will believe is that we just got massively better recruitment on our side of the house. We got more people wanting to play for your club, and that meant you were able to field better teams more often and in a better way. They then then tell you that financial stability is particularly important. Notably here, all of their current content, even as it exists in the best possible case, is fairly marginal claims that have a fairly limited impact, especially when we prove to you that there is a significant benefit to players here, right? To the way you can recruit them. But firstly, they tell you there are high costs when you are locked into like bad contracts and you get relegated. Obviously, number one, this is probably a vitiating event on the contract. These contracts are probably specifically to play in Premier League football, not like second league football. At that point, contractual law just like rules it out. But secondly, right, if both sides still have the full scale of the contract enforced, so if you believe they're pushed, you also must then believe that the incentives pay remains in place. And that means that you are potentially having to pay these players much more in a lower league, and they're likely to fulfill all of their like performance-based incentives there because they're just much better than the players in the lower league. And at that point, that was a significantly higher cost. And then you still had to pay a player during injury. Obviously, you still have to do that under their side as well. Secondly, it was just untrue, right? Like when players are injured, they just don't get paid their match fee, so you don't have to play them for every match they play, right? And also, we noted in the last match how you better dealt with injuries specifically under our side of the house. They tell you that when your star player was injured, this fucks you up. Obviously, this is probably contracted out, but even there, we think that actually, if you had this, even if you believe the biggest, nastiest push that you had to keep paying LeBron James for 10 years, this meant that LeBron James had a reason to hang around your club, and you could engage them in the way, in like club building and like mentorship, and that was particularly beneficial for you as a team, right? Maybe they solved the financial issue from a week-to-week basis, but they did not solve it on a 2, 3, or 5 year issue, right? When we get a significant financial stability, which is what we do get, right? Because note what they push at third is that actually we do like get more money and that gives us more stability. Obviously more money was only useful if we could plan for it, and we were unsure of what our team would do in the next 2 or 3 or 4 years. That was incredibly difficult to plan the dynasty and the consistency of your club, right? Because they were right, you could know what all of your players are doing this season or in the next month or weeks, but you could never, 1, know what your opposition was going to do, 2, predict injury, 3, predict the opposition, 4, predict player misconduct, right? You never know when Todd Carney's going to go off and pull the bubble, right? At that point, it just made these things very difficult to predict long term. So maybe you solved the month-to-month pay issue there, maybe you solved it on a singular season. When you had fixed contracts, you knew that every day, for the next few years, you knew how much money you're going to have. And that meant you could plan. You could decide how many physios you wanted, you could decide what players you were going to increase, look to, you could decide what grassroots programs you were going to invest in, you could decide what stadium options and upgrades you wanted to pursue. Those were really important because that's what ensured you could consistently produce results. And this mattered whether you saved money or like spent more money as a club, because either way, it was still your ability to plan and lock in those longer contracts with support teams, with sponsors. Those sorts of things meant that actually having this long-term stability was incredibly important in this debate, right? Maybe they reduced, yeah, cool. Because that was what enabled you to create fan engagement by saying we will have this player for the next 3 years, or to be saying we will improve our stadium in this way, or we will provide better training facilities in that way. You couldn't do that when you had no long-term ability to gauge what your incomes and costs were going to be. Maybe if clubs, like even if you believe clubs are smart and useful and intelligent, you still get a better set of tools and a better set of information to do that and be smart and intelligent with under our side of the house. At the end of this debate, we got better players. We could deal with them better because we could plan how to deal with them over the next 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years. And that's why we took this debate.
As I commence this reply, one thing I want you to think is about the opposition argues their case on the edge cases. They argue what happens when your team comes first or when your team comes last. You pay lots of players, but you win, so you get lots of money. Or you lose, but you can sink all of those costs. But they never argue for the middle ground. The fact that the majority of sports teams have some successes and losses, and sometimes they'll make finals, but they won't necessarily go all the way. And it's these teams on which the majority of teams on which the opposition loses outcomes. Because it's when their stress cases do not work, it's when predictability and increasing your chances in the future becomes more important. And on those metrics, we're clearly winning today. 2 questions then in reply. Firstly, on which side better achieves good financial management, and secondly, which better achieves success. Let's start with the financial management material. They really, to be honest, only have one path to victory in this issue, which is to suggest you can sink the cost for instability far better because you pay players less. A couple of observations here. The first thing to note is this is just them having their cake and eating it too. Because notably, if you're sinking the cost by paying players a huge amount less of money, these players are just likely to fuck up or not engage with contracts for you in the future, because at the point you are paying them less, they have less incentive to want to continue to operate under your club, and they'd rather go somewhere else, perhaps somewhere that offers a fixed contract with a heavy degree of guarantee. In the cases when, as we explained, performance is often not just about you as an individual, it's about the team. So to the extent you're on a failing team and you're being paid less for that when you feel you're doing well, that's huge incentive for you to move away on their side, which notably perhaps still means this benefit is true, but it knives their ability to win the other path to victory in this debate, because it means the players that they get are far, far worse. But secondly, we just observed at first negative in this debate that because your costs are more predictable on our side, you know things like the contract prices already, means you're better able to negotiate the other types of unstable and fluctuous costs within sport, which simply means that this actually isn't that much of a harm, because we've already prepared around this, because we already know how much money we're spending on this particular element at the start of the season. So comparatively, maybe they're marginally better here, but it's really unclear why this is a debate-winning harm for them. Their next suggestion then is to say, oh, well, this means you can maximize your investment at the end season. This is the only concretization of that impact they provide. But notably, we would just say this is A, speculative, but B, it's just far better that you have very consistent investment you can plan early throughout the season, because obviously you cannot just invest once and hope it all pays off. Sport often has grinding costs and continuous upfront costs, so it's way better to play around that. Which means that this insulation from cost is achieved by both sides, maybe really comparatively better on after the absolute worst cases, but it drives away other benefits that they try to claim in the debate. Which means then, given this is the only path to victory they have under this issue, it's also contingent though on the idea that clubs will just construct these incentive-based contracts particularly well, and notably, their justification for why these clubs do it well is entirely symmetric. The reasons they identify for why they're good financial managers are equally true on our side, but we provide a series of comparative reasons which never responded to that explain why they are likely to be substantially worse. The first thing which they concede to is that you incentivize financial risk-taking, not over-leveraging, because you might expect to over-leverage on one or two things, but not on all of them. Secondly, we explain that season-to-season variance makes your income and investment consistency of investment, enormously difficult to manage. Thirdly, it means that you have to plan for spending far more, even if you assume, so if you assume this is true, you have to plan for the case where you spend far, far more, which reduces your financial flexibility, knifing other benefits they try to claim under this issue. And notably, it's entirely reliant on the idea that when you win and have to pay lots of money, it increases your profits so you can pay for it, which we observe at second, that one, not true for all leagues that exist in the world, but also requires you going all the way in winning, whereas often if you, for example, have a good season but end up fourth, you do not get this financial return and so you're just screwed over. Which suggests maybe if you wouldn't spoon, this team is better for you, but not if you get anywhere else in the league. Then let's turn to the second question on achieving success. And notably, by explaining that we have very predictable costs here and are better able to incentivize players, we're already ahead on this issue, because they never actually engage with our characterization on what sports players care about. We tell you that their careers are fluctuous, they do not know how long they'll last, and that means they have to maximize the stability of their earnings because of the fact that they know that's guaranteed, and it gives them that ability to plan out their own lives into the future, which suggests then that we just engage with that set of incentives far, far better. And they never explain, aside from suggesting an optimism bias, why it is the case that sports players like to prefer these types of contracts. Because especially if you've played a couple of seasons of sport already, you know your form can slip at any time, you know unpredictably things happen. It's a very difficult thing to control season in, season out, even if you are a good player, and certainly if you're an average player in the majority of these leagues. Which suggests then that by getting better players, we're far able to actualize the condition that they themselves said is the only path to victory of actually winning these competitions far, far more. Which is to say, you get better players, you have a healthier culture, we financially manage far more consistently than them in almost all cases aside from maybe edge ones better, even taking them charitable. You cannot give this debate to any team other than side negative.
Panel, don't let side negative lie to you. Injured players still get paid the entirety amount of their money when they're on fixed contracts, even when they're injured. And players who get relegated on our side do get lower wage because they can no longer meet the performance mechanism of playing Premier League games. Note here, the interest of the club was always in this debate literally to screw players over and pay them less when they do badly, and it was to pay players who do well more because they want to keep them. Notably, we are the only side in this debate that can do this, and we're the only side that actively means that clubs have control over their destiny and the ability to determine how much money they pay to players dependent on their positions. First question I'll ask is, do clubs do better on our side? And notably, they try and weigh this out of the debate by saying things like, this is based on recruitment, and financial management is more important. But there are a couple issues with this framing from the opposition, because we told you down the bench that winning increases the amount of fans, the amount of ticket sales, and the amount of brand awareness you get, And it means, secondly, that you get qualification to leagues like the Champions League, other forms of extra revenue. But thirdly, it means you get more access to prize money. They say that this is only something that exists for when you win, but notably, almost all sports in the world have access to things like staggered prize money, which means literally in things like the F1 and in the NFL, when you come first, you get the first amount of prize money. When you come fifth, you get the fifth amount of prize money, and this staggers down on a step basis until you come last. So this was never out of the debate. And fourthly, we told you that it means your club simply goes up in value. Because when you buy Chelsea in 2004 for like $50 million, and then you sell it in 2020 for $4 billion, this increase in revenue far outweighs any possible financial issues that accrued in the meantime. And notably, this means that winning is literally the way you secure financial growth and stability. So this was the only thing you ought weigh at any rate in this debate. Okay, why are we so far ahead here? We told you first, it allows you to pivot away from injured players who takes up heaps of your salary cap. Secondly, we told you it means you can go for a Moneyball approach and risk and take risks on players who might be good in the future, like for example Brighton is in the Premier League right now. Thirdly, we told you it just means your players don't get lazy, and notably this is an example that exists in many instances, because players like Hazard or half the NBA, who are financially secured for life on fixed contracts, no longer have the incentive to play that NBA game when it's in the middle of the season and it doesn't really matter that much anymore. And fourth, it means you can prioritize advanced metrics, and metrics that aren't for the priority of players. Like for example, how far you run in a game, or how much expected goals or passes created you make. And these are the advanced metrics we told you at first from Toby that we weigh so highly in this debate. They are not the goals and assists that the opposition wants to talk about, but literally things that the team is able to control and force you to play in a way which suits their style. They say some responses which amounts to issues of inflexibility and selfishness to score, but this never stood because we told you our side literally gives clubs more control over how their players work and forces them not to be selfish. Their analysis, which is you go for the 75% pass, you go for the 75% try, not the 90% pass, is exactly what you no longer do onto our side, because this is the exact point of an advanced metric, which is to say it knows what is the 90% option and it prioritizes you doing that outcome. And that's what we told you down the bench. Then they say a bunch of mitigation, which is to say why a bunch of players still want to perform well. But note here, they never told you why the players' conception of them playing well is actually what the club's perception of them playing well is. And we would like a world where the club's conception is the one that determines how much they get paid. And notably, because they never differentiated this method ought never stand. But notably, this never gets ahead our analysis of why players don't actually care enough to play in many instances, and the examples that we gave you. Then they're like, this debate occurs in middling teams. But note the variation for middling clubs is obviously lower. No 10th place team has a player who scores 10 goals, and no 10th place team has star players who have these high incentives. So if they want to stake their case on this, there's absolutely no delta that occurs in this debate because they are so standardized. We told you, we are the house that wins the game, we are the house that wins the league, and we are the house that secures your financial future. And that's why we want this debate.
Hi everyone, thank you all for a great debate. I think we both agreed it was a really close and really enjoyable debate. I'm going to give some general feedback on that as a result and then go through the reasons for the result. I think 3.5 things in general feedback. The first one is, this debate is actually pretty good at it. I think you get away with having a reasonably sporty judge panel, but use of examples, just make sure you are stepping through what exactly those examples are, and why they work and how they fit, because you're quite likely the Australs get a judge who's never seen an NRL game in their life, which is a true tragedy for them, but making sure you are explaining all those examples, especially in the sports debate when you're sporting, you know everything that's happening. Secondly, this one wasn't a massive issue and lots of the debate could have been improved in certain areas. Ultimately, I think actually does become quite decisive in one part of the debate, is make sure you're linking back a lot more to the actors' incentives and really I think stepping out what the consequence of the argument is, not just the argument you're making, but then the consequence to how the actor in this debate perceives that and what they would value as a consequence of that. That'll become more clear, I think, in the oral adjudication. The third thing, it's actually quite similar to this one, is just there's a few claims in the debate that are made when we say, why does this matter? Why does this help further the clause of why this person would prefer X contract over Y contract? So I guess those two things are the same. And the last half point, it's a half point because it's actually just feedback for reply speakers. Sorry to call you guys out, but so much new material in reply today, so much new rebuttal, so many new examples. Really rein that in. I think your replies were both good, but I was constantly writing new, come on, we know the rules. You know, Sridham's a great reply speaker, but he just gives rebuttal, so don't listen to that example. All right, in terms of the results then, it was a split decision, but as the chair, I get the final call. Sorry to the losing team. Ultimately, the debate was awarded to side AF. Congratulations. Sorry to side Neg, who was regular viewers of the ADC YouTube channel will now realise it's 2 weeks in a row of giving you a loss in a sport motion from negative in round 1 of a mini. All right, 3 issues. Firstly, on interests, everyone broadly agreed about money being the ultimate thing. I think there's some initial stuff about prioritising what gets you the most money, but the debate ends up becoming about whether or not stability or performance and how all those things factor in to being most likely to happen, because we all agree those equal more money, so we care about making more money at the end of the debate. So, shockingly, then there are 2 big questions for after that, finance and performance. I want to start with performance of players and performance of the team. So the first part, I think there's like 4 subparts to this. The first subpart is on how much does this actually incentivize players to do a lot more and to do better. So Ned gives a bunch of reasoning to say, well, when you have a financial incentive, you'll train harder, you'll work harder, you'll want to do better, you'll work more with the team because you want to get the payout at the end of the day, and what helps your team helps you. I think Negative has some very reasonable and fair responses here to say that actually a lot of this is quite symmetric for a lot of players. So the desire to win, etc., the fact you want to make more money in long-term contracts, the fact you want a legacy build, probably means that for the vast majority of players, this actually ends up staying as quite very little change in the amount of the amount of change that actually happens in what the players' incentives are. So I think this actually makes it probably not a massive win on this point at all for everyone, just the incentives of the players. I think that what Negative is able, so what AF is able to walk away with is maybe there's a few examples they point to of like some guy in Chelsea who has played badly. So I think in theory, I'm likely to believe that this could have an impact on some players, but probably for the overall majority of players, I think Negative is able to walk away saying that it doesn't actually make a difference. Secondly, though, on this, I think then Neg points out that actually there's a lot of stuff that impacts player performance that is out of their control. Things like injuries, psychological dramas, like the death of a family member, etc. And all these reasons mean you can't control your player behaviour. And at this point of the argumentation, I'm like, yep, totally fair. I agree that's outside the player's control. Where I think AF's able to win that back is the framing that we get in later speeches, just like, well, we're the owner, we're the manager, we don't give a shit. All we care about is you playing your best. And if there are external factors that mean you're not playing your best, we don't particularly care about that. We will happily pay you less because you're not performing as well. And that fits in their incentives. And I think this is where that feedback of like taking it to the next level of how this impacts something that the management then cares about, it just seems like 2 steps away, but I don't think comes out enough from Neg to try and flip as to why the management would care about that in particular, like the happiness of their players compared to like the potential financial gain they could make from their players. So then the second part of this clash becomes one around gameplay and whether or not you act more selfishly or more selflessly in the play. I think the Negative here has the good example around the 70-90, so you'll take the 70% chance on yourself rather than risking it on the 90. I think the first thing I'd note here is a lot of this stuff about being like how selfish you'd be, etc., does become a little bit symmetric given that everyone agrees players want to achieve the best results for the team and do want to win things as well. So they want to win and they've got more chance of winning by passing, and it seems like they would do that on both sides. But I think also what AF is able to do is respond a bit more by explaining that like the way you can factor in advanced analytics, the metrics you use, run meters, passes, stuff we're hearing from first about how you assist in the tries or assist in the goals, all means that those factors can be accounted for. So it would actually be more beneficial for you to take the 90% chance and 70% chance, because that will still help your pay go up and make you look good. I think this gameplay stuff probably just needed more from both teams in the debate as well, but I think it's probably maybe a marginal thing to aff on this. The third thing on culture of the club, I think absolutely needed more from both teams, and I think this actually probably links quite well to the stuff in the first sub-point about whether or not it's fair and how that links to each other. I think just you're more need to hear about how the culture of the club would actually work and cooperate as a consequence of having these contracts being different. I think to the extent that like you see a player getting paid more or less than another player based on their performances, broadly symmetrical to status quo where good players get paid more in their contracts anyway, so it didn't seem like a hugely decisive sub-point. The last sub-point then is on recruitment. A bit of broken record here, again pointed a bit more from both teams, because at this point it's just like, with the question of recruitment, I'm as a judge left unsure about what do we want out of recruitment. Do we want to buy the best new players? Buy the best existing players? Do we want to recruit the newest, youngest, hottest talent? Do we want a grassroots, etc.? So all these different strategies about how we get better, good recruitment. All a bit unclear about why management necessarily prioritise or want those things necessarily, which I think makes this issue a little bit more difficult or less important in the debate. I think the the other thing that makes this recruitment issue complicated is this question of whether or not like we're living in a world where every sports team does this or just some sports teams do it. Like, you know, what does the league look like? I think it's probably reasonable to say that this is an existing status quo thing in lots of variations. At best, they're probably, I guess to meet their burden the debate, they are upping it and making more I think it's in the interest of that person to do it. So to the extent there might be some players, I think Neg proves that would want to have that stability, lock in the end of their contract, just get 5-4 years, etc. It's fair. So it might affect some players to act that way. Probably also a bunch of players who would just sign with these clubs anyway because of the money that's on offer, the optimism bias, etc. But to make that a really decisive issue for either team, teams needed to really sell what the recruitment process was best, but also whether or not there'd be a dramatic change to how clubs would succeed, not succeed, collapse, etc. Would all the players flood away from the variable contracts into fixed contract clubs, or vice versa? What would that look like? I think this issue to ultimately be a decisive one. What I do think Ash's able to prove is that you might take more risks on younger players, so maybe newer players get in because they can put them on a low base contract. If they do really good, you've got the first move advantage, you pay them more later. So I think they get credit for that and helps them win this issue, but it's not ultimately the thing that wins in the debate because it's a question of I don't know if that is the best way for the sports teams to recruit their players. All right, so that deals with performance. Let's then look at finances then and how finance works. I think the finance issue is actually where we had the split on the panel, and I'll get to the point where that becomes decisive. So I think stability being good is probably a good and agreed upon thing here, and I think Neg impacts why stability is likely to be a good thing for the club. The question more becomes about whether or not you actually get more of this here. Because the nagging question I have the whole time in the Neg case is that yes, you make player salaries this consistent thing that stays the same across the whole contract series, but AF consistently points out to the debate that there's lots of other things that are variable, and if your performance varies, then the amount of money you rake in from spectators, from jerseys, from the value of your club, from accessing Champions League, all that sort of stuff remains hugely fluctuating. So you have one stable cost that can remain to be expensive when everything else becomes fluctuating, becomes a lot worse if those players do badly, if they get injured, if they just are lazy or whatever, which means that in terms of stability, I think, maybe this what AF's able to prove at the end of the day is that Neg maybe gets stability in one area, but that stability is actually a problem because it doesn't allow you to deal with all the other fluctuations. So having something that fluctuates the costs down as your performance goes down means you're better able to have financial stability within that club. So that's what I've said there. I think then there's two big pushes and claims back from negative on this. The first is that it was actually sort of difficult then if you have all these variabilities, because of things like salary caps and fair play rules, etc. I think AF has some pretty reasonable stuff here that you would just do it in an intelligent way. Like you would set up separate pools for that money, you would operate underneath the salary cap, you'd have different contract rules, etc., which probably all means you could do it in ways that are somewhat intelligent. I think I'm reasonably give AF capacity to say that clubs would have a financial incentive to do it that way. I think the other good response they give is just that leagues have lots of capacity and lots of incentives as well to accommodate for those sorts of variabilities. So things like the NBA's rules that if you're an all-star, you have extra salary stuff outside the salary cap, etc., which means that because it's in the league's interest to have this, they're able to vary those rules around that too. It doesn't seem like it's as strict or as stuck as the NRL is with its salary cap. So I think at that point then maybe it is more, it's like a logistical difficulty, but doesn't necessarily outweigh the capacity to deal with fluctuating costs. Oh, I should also note that whether or not those costs fluctuate was the turning point between us on the panel. The last thing then, the last claim we get from negative is this idea about, well, this only deals with clubs at either extreme. What about the clubs in the middle who are doing well each season? I think the problem here is it's an interesting question that's posed, but then the response just goes back to we just want stability to know what our output looks like, but it didn't seem like why this would massively harm them. Then if they did better, they got more money in, then they could pay for the extra costs because they were earning more. If they did worse, they could have to pay the players as much going forward. So it didn't seem like middling teams became the ultimate big important thing. I can't credit this, but I think Neg reply also has the right response where it just gives the rebuttal that middling teams are consistent, so the costs are actually more predictable in a middling team, that it does the same pretty well each time. But again, it was new, so I couldn't credit it as the win. The one thing I forgot to say around difficulty, was just the stuff on relegation promotion. I don't think this is a decisive way for either thing, because as both teams point out, there's contractual incentives on both sides to pay less when you get relegated. So if you get kicked out or kicked down, whether it's a fixed contract, you have a clause to get out or get paid less, variable contract, you just pay them less, you're not meeting their goals. Both sides kind of deal with the relegation thing. It doesn't become decisive or victory making either side. So at the end of that then, I think maybe it doesn't have a huge impact on lots of performance. It does have a marginal impact on the performance of some degree of players, but the incentives of the management are just to get the best out of get the best out of their players that they can, and is likely in their way to punish them if they're not doing well. And secondly, on finance, the fluctuating costs better help are in the incentives of these managers to help deal with fluctuating other costs and revenue and things like that as well, which is ultimately why AF's able to take a narrow win in the debate. I hope that all made sense. If anyone wants any questions, have any feedback, please feel free to myself or Adam, either over lunch or whatever. But otherwise, good luck for the rest of the comp and the Frustrals.